Hello and welcome, and thank you everybody for joining us. To start off with, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting, or at least I am meeting, on Judgeron country, and we are here to talk about Autumn Book Binge, which is still going on even though the libraries aren't as accessible in a physical way. We're still online, you can still borrow books from us, and you can still join in on Book Binge, which has all of these little things. If you don't know what Book Binge is a challenge for adults to read at least 9 books from 9 different categories over the course of 3 different months. And there is a prize for every month that you do it. Do 3 categories here, 3 categories here, 3 categories here. And when we reopen, we will take all of those and put them in the draw for 3 readings book prizes. And it's a nice way just to challenge yourself to different types of reading that you wouldn't normally do. So you can download that from our website. Yes?
Can you just tell us what the categories are?
Categories are... What have we got? Alternate worlds, in translation, which is books that have been translated.
Yep.
Beastly titles, so books with an animal in the title. Recent releases, anything that's been published in the last 12 months. Nice, easy one. Set in Victoria. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander writers. Other lives, which is biographies about people who inspire you, or just biographies. Books to screen, so books that have been made into movies or TV series. And fact to fiction, so works of fiction that are based on true stories. So there's a whole heap of different things there. All of those are listed on our website as well, under the Book Binge tab, with a whole heap of suggestions. Our BorrowBox app should even have, when you log in, a nice little shelf that's got a whole heap of different suggested books that fit in those categories as well that you can pick from. That'll be up and running in the next few days if it's not already there.
And Stuart, they can download an application form, is that right, and print it?
Yeah, so that application form is on our website with instructions. Just go to ncgrl.vic.gov.au and download it from there, or just do it online and keep note of what you've read and just bring it all in at the end when we all reopen. And your prize for coming in with all of that done is you get to hopefully have some new books to buy. So yeah, we'll be doing 3 prize draws all in one go. So the more you read, the more chances you have to get a nice, whatever book you wanted to read that wasn't on that list. So what's everybody been reading?
So in light of this, we're talking about some of the books that we've read recently in those categories. And I'm happy to start if you like.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay, so mine, I've just read, is that backward to front for you?
That's perfect. We can actually see that.
Yeah. So it's Moana Hope, her biography called My Way, and it's the set in Victoria one that I'm claiming it under because she grew up in Victoria, and she's actually a Collingwood, female Collingwood football player. And her story is quite extraordinary, and I really only picked it because I've only just finished it and I couldn't think of anything else, and I just grabbed it. And I also have been watching on TV the Australian Survivor series, and she got to 3rd place in that as well. So, and I just liked her spirit, and I like the way she plays football. And her life is quite extraordinary. She is one of 13 children, grew up very tough, was a carer for her father, who died when she was about 15, I think. But she cared for him for about 2 years. So missed out on a lot of school, isn't very well educated, but has really put her strength into her football. She said she and her brothers grew up kicking the footy around their suburb in Melbourne, and that's she just loved doing that, and it became a passion. And she was so delighted when the AFL Women's League started, because she could actually turn her passion into a career, which she'd never thought she would be able to do. So I just thought her story was quite inspiring.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah.
Have you read Educated yet, Kinta?
No, I haven't. I've got it here on my bookshelf to start, and it was one I've returned 3 times because other people have reserved it, but now they can't, so I've got it.
Because that's a similar theme. Someone who grew up completely uneducated and tried to make a living doing stuff that they loved, but educated is also really, really well written. So yes,
Yeah.
I reckon you in particular will really love that one. So
Yeah, great. Yeah, I do love reading autobiographies. I find true stories are quite inspiring, and everybody's just got their own story to tell, and everybody's got something to tell out of their life, I find.
Great. Well, I can go next if you like.
Okay.
My book was called In Love with George Eliot, and it would fall under several of those categories because I thought straight away that it would come under fact to fiction, but it would also come under other lives and maybe even one of the other ones, which I can't quite remember. Oh, in the last 12 months, I think it's a new book. So it's the sort of book that I've tried to read in the past and really hated when people try and do a sort of fictional version of a historic figure. It usually irritates the heck out of me. But this one is just brilliant. And the author, whose name is Catherine, somebody I've forgotten, I haven't got it with me. I borrowed it from the library and then I had to give it back because it had lots of reserves on it. So I don't have it with me, but I've ordered a copy because I like it so much I want to own it. So the author is an academic herself, and she must be an expert on George Eliot, who's a 19th century author, considered it's a woman called Marian Evans, and she's considered one of the greatest novelists of all time, which sounds really heavy, but her books are fantastic. But anyway, the author has written it so that it's sort of a split story. It's Marian Evans's life from just the point at which her first novel's been published and people don't know who she is. They think it's a man, they're sure it's a man, and the literary world's abuzz trying to find out who is this author. And some of them had decided it was this bloke who lived in Sheffield and he was taking the credit, but it wasn't him. But anyway, the reason I really don't like books like that normally is that they seem so fake and so artificial. But this one, the way she's written it, she's just made it so natural, and just the conversations and the facts are so convincing that you just can't believe that it's not autobiography or something. So she had quite a dramatic life. She shacked up with a guy called Henry Lewis, who had a wife who was living with his best friend at the time, and he was raising the best friend's children and financing their relationship, as well as living with George Eliot unmarried because he already had a wife. And it showed how George Eliot, even though she was such a great writer, was completely ostracized from society. She couldn't meet respectable people, even though her husband was able to meet with, royalty and mix among great circles and so on. But George Eliot was really imprisoned in her room, writing things. And the other weird thing is how insecure she was, even though the world was heaping praise on her novels. Henry had to keep bolstering her self-esteem, and he really loved her, even though she wasn't a beauty at all, and supported her until his untimely death. That's another element, is the kind of dreadful illnesses people got that couldn't be cured and so on, and the suffering that they had. But through that story is a modern story of Kate, who's sort of maybe the author, may not be, who is preparing for a conference on George Eliot. So you get these little windows of the world of academia and the sort of catty infighting that goes on there through that story, but a bit of a romance emerges. And I just can't explain why normally this type of thing would irritate me, but it was just a great read, and I can highly recommend it to anybody. So that's my read. I haven't got a picture of it to show you, but it's a good read. In Love with George Eliot. I should have written the author's name down.
People can Google it, Sue.
Yeah, they can.
If they're watching this, they're on the internet right now. Go do that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
So you're a George Eliot fan normally then?
I studied her books, and they're fantastic reads. They really are. But I probably go back every 10 years and read one, but not sort of crazy impressed. Crazy in love with George Eliot myself, but I thought just the bringing to life that whole period of time and her life and her vulnerability as a woman, it just has modern echoes and things for people to read as well. But so convincing, just so convincing. So I don't know how much.
It's good when an author can do that.
Sorry, Kinta?
Sorry, Sue, I cut in. It's good when an author can do that, because it really sounds like she drew you into the story and got you really involved. Yeah,
completely. I kept having to read bits to my husband all the time. Listen to this.
Oh wow, that's a good sign.
Yeah, it is a good sign.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
How about you, Brenda?
Okay, well, my book that I've been reading, or I read last year, but just did a little bit of a refresher and fell in love with it all over again, is by a Swedish author, Fredrik Backman. Now, he's known for, he's the author of a prize-winning book called A Man Called Ove. But the book I read is My Grandmother Sends Her Regards and Apologizes.
Right.
And I love this book on a number of levels, because the main characters are an old woman and a 7-year-old little girl. It's so beautifully and sensitively written by a 38-year-old man. And he promises that it's not based on his grandmother or himself. But it starts with, he writes that every 7-year-old needs a superhero. And for Elsa, Granny is her superhero. But very early on in the novel, Granny passes away and leaves Elsa with a series of things to do, to right all the wrongs that Granny has done to people living in her apartment. So I just have to go back and say that I loved it because for the line in itself, where it's a grandmother is both a sword and a shield. And Granny was that for Elsa, because Elsa was very different. She was a very bright child, but didn't seem to fit in anywhere. Her parents had divorced, and she was living with her mum, but with a new partner, and her mum was pregnant. So Elsa wasn't keen on this upcoming new arrival, and her dad had remarried, and she didn't like going to stay with him. At school, she was bullied, and so Granny was her refuge, and she helped Elsa escape all of this by telling stories, fairy tales. So they went to this magical land together. So the book is just multi-layered. And as it turns out, all Granny's fairy tales were actually based on people living in the apartment building that Elsa herself lived in. And it was these people that Elsa had to right the wrongs or apologise for Granny's bad behaviour, including a very ferocious dog who lived in one of the apartments by itself, and Granny would feed it. So Elsa had to approach the dog, and then there was a very dark character that she was frightened of. But each of these characters had their own stories, and it sort of unfolded that Elsa, one by one, had to right these wrongs and apologise for Granny's bad behaviour. In doing that, while Granny had been Elsa's superhero, Elsa kind of had to become her own hero, or Granny's champion. And, it was that classic hero's journey where at the end, Elsa is the hero of the story by righting all these wrongs, bringing people in the apartment building together, and just coming to terms with her own situation and being able to cope with going to school and being bullied, but standing up that she was different and that was okay. The other thing that I want to say is that it was both funny and very sad, that Elsa loved Harry Potter, and so she was quite fanatical about that. The other thing that with Elsa, that all her information, which she would argue with anyone who challenged her, that WikiLeaks was the only source of reliable information. So it is just a fabulous story with unusually an old woman and a small child as the drivers of the narrative. And in reading about him, he revised that novel 50 times. So it's just so beautifully written, so well crafted, and I would recommend it to anyone.
Great.
I suppose that makes it my turn.
What categories would you put that
in
one
translation,
in?
because
of course.
been translated from the Swedish.
Yeah.
So, but just I couldn't put it down. Just had to read it and read it and read it. So I would thoroughly recommend it.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
What about you, Stuart?
So me, the one that I've read most recently that fits in one of the categories is The Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi, which is a young adult fantasy novel. It was one of the really big names in young adult fantasy last year, late the year before, partly because it was all written from a very non-European fantasy background. It's very much based on African traditions rather than the usual sword and sorcery and elves and all that sort of stuff. The magic in this is much from a much different sort of cultural background. I didn't like it as much as everybody says you should. I thought it was great. There was some amazing themes in it about different ways people are oppressed, how magic users basically had all their power stolen from them and then were being oppressed by non-magic users. But even, that's the very simple, big powerful people took something away from somebody. But there's also this nice little interweaving of how actually the magic users were kind of dangerous, and if they get magic back, they're going to do some bad things to these other people. And everybody in there was very human. The antagonist, who is chasing the three main characters through the entire book, is complex and dark and hopeful, and like you kind of root for this guy who is going to destroy everything good the main characters are trying to have happen. But you can see where he's coming from the entire time, and you feel sad about his bad choices rather than angry at him, and you feel hopeful when he makes a good choice, and all that sort of stuff is great. And the magic system itself is interesting, but because it's almost a book about how magic's been taken away, it doesn't get fleshed out very much. So you can't really have this all big in-depth magic system. It's kind of just hinted at, and then nothing happens with it. And the same thing with it's a story of how different cultures have been destroyed, and all these different people with slightly different magical backgrounds have had all that stuff taken away from them, and then they've been oppressed. And so the cultural groupings that they'd had are again sort of washed out and a little bit grey. So you don't get that same sort of sense of exploration you often get through fantasy. That is kind of redeemed by you like the main characters very much, but I think it's very much the thematic stuff that makes this a really interesting book, and the fact that the main antagonist is so complex. But even having said that, everybody was talking this book up so much. I think I was expecting it to be a 10 out of 10. And I kind of found it an 8.5 or a 9 out of 10. So I was slightly disappointed, which is a bit sad because it's still a really good book. But
that's the trouble with those really, really popular books, isn't it? That Whereas if no one's talking about it, it's your discovery sort of thing.
Yes, and then you can be really excited, and you get everybody else really excited, and then somehow they're not quite as excited about it as you were.
I finally came to the. Sorry, Stuart. I finally came to the conclusion a few years back that I just myself personally don't like award-winning writers, because I felt that I had to read them, and I read them, and I'd struggle through them, and I'd go, "Well, I don't like this," and yet they win awards, and that's just for me personally. But yeah.
People always ask you in the library, have you read it about these
Yeah.
bestsellers? You go, oh no, it's too popular. I can't get it copied.
That's
Right.
I've never read a Booker Prize winner that I liked.
Yeah.
I try every couple of years. It just doesn't happen for me.
It's usually the seconds and thirds, or the top ones, but not the winner, that are good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like
I will-
the Fredrik Backman, because this was A Man Called Ove, which I think they made a movie of it, and obviously it's quite good. But this one, I don't think has won any awards. But for me, it was just such a multi-layered, beautiful book.
Yeah. Yeah.
I will say I do usually like the CBCA award winners, the Children's Book Council of Australia. They usually pick pretty good books. Even if my favourite doesn't win, the one they pick is usually pretty good.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I still think they get a bit stuck in a rut though too. They always pick the same authors.
Yeah,
And they like the same authors, whereas
they're not
there
very
are others.
brave. Yes.
No, not
And-
brave to go out to different authors.
there does seem to be, like, I've talked with one of the other librarians who's a young adult writer, and the CBCA seem to have an almost approved Australian young adult style of writing where there's a certain sameness to all of the winners. They're often quite good writers, but there's everyone seems to be aiming at the same sort of stylistic grouping. Even the ones who are often a little bit weird with it, there's still this similarity to the voice, which is a little odd.
And you wonder how much that's to do with publishing as well, that wanting that reassurance that this genre and this style is going to sell.
And it may even be everybody going through the same 3 or 4 editors as well.
Yeah, that's a good point too.
I had a friend who illustrated a children's book with a red-headed child, like her own red-headed child, and the publishers told her she had to change the child to not a redhead, because they never wanted redheads in those days, back in the day.
Yeah.
And I was going to say about judging, I once saw some people judge an art contest, and I was completely appalled because there were 3 judges. They all loved a completely different piece. So the only one they could agree on was one that they thought was about 3rd best, and that one won. So I just think anything that's a committee is going to judge, you're going to get a pretty mediocre winner.
Yeah.
And all the fabulous things will be in there, but not they didn't win.
Yeah. Interesting.
Well, the CBCA shortlists are all out, or long lists are all out at the moment. So again, if you're on the internet, go look them up. There's a whole list of really great books in there, and of course, the best one won't win. But go and read some of those. Yeah. So, has anybody else got anything else they wanted to add?
Not really, not at this stage.
No.
Well,
I'd like to know.
very much
I'd like to give you the author's name, but I can't.
I've just been looking it up in the background.
Catherine somebody.
Great. Well, thank you all for being part of that experiment.
Thank you.
Everybody who's watching at home, go to our website, ncgrl.vic.gov.au, and download the Book Binge page, fill it out, and bring it all back when we're ready, and go into the draw for all of those prizes. And at the very least, give yourself an excuse to sit down and read. You've got a whole lot of different categories to try and get your head around.